It's time to do an odd one, Canadian Civil War, or CCW, which incidentally was play name for my ex, with the first C being Clueless. One of a couple of people I knew who fit that quite well, although I was able to improve her ability to notice things, which was cool. Okay. So, this is an interesting game, and you can see from the map, gee, that doesn't look much like Canada. Yeah. It's a political representation, kind of like, if you remember when I did Plot to Assassinate Hitler, which is, I'm trying to find it, kicking around somewhere up here, and I'm just not seeing it. Oh, there it is. Well worth watching for the same kind of reason, because this is the similar type of game, one of these power politics type things, although Plot to Assassinate Hitler had more of a military feel than this does. In terms of a geometrical war game type feel, this actually has it, the same as that, the same as Origins of World War II, which I really have to get to at some point up there. Where you're fighting on kind of a different plane, but you've got a certain kind of terrain, in this case, the different zones that it's in, and these seas here, whatever. Very limited, and very abstracted. And you've got pieces which look very much like military units. They have essentially a combat strength up on top, and a movement value there. Now, the game actually does have a military component, which is these pieces here, which it can devolve into. I'll talk about that later. That's unlikely with me playing it solo, but it seems to happen with other people. We got these little markers which are going to indicate the number of issues that each person controls and the number of constituents that they control. All right. The goal of the game is to control certain issues, and this one I believe is a homemade one, but I don't think I actually need it. I lost. So this game came, and I think the only way it came, in one of these damn flat boxes. I bought it new. Might be the only flat box that I bought new. Not sure about that. Nah, I bought Kursk new as well. I really dislike the format for storage and etc. I would rather have had a folio type game, and I've more or less turned mine into that, except the cover is so big that I kind of have to keep the flat box with it. So I don't know, but they're a pain in the ass. They don't hold the counters very well. Very easy to lose the counters if you don't tape everything down. So the box doesn't hold the tray doesn't hold the counters well. Basically, what you've got is this thing's not open. You've got a couple of little pieces of plastic that slap on top. You've got these completely open, and then you've got this piece of crap which tries to hold it all. And that works fine when you first buy the game, but after, 5 years or so, that thing's a mess. And you can't treat them roughly at all. They'll split, they'll crack, etc. Alright, I seem to be trying to avoid getting to the rolls. I'm actually fairly comfortable with these, but I haven't looked at them in a little while, because I've been busy with some other things. Let me see if there's anything else I should go over here. Yeah, I should go over some of this. So you get this charts and tables. This gives you the setup. There's two different scenarios: the Quiet Revolution, which is the 3-player scenario, and the Referendum, which is the big classic 4-player scenario. The Quiet Revolution is from the 1950s. The Referendum is contemporaneous with the publication of the game, late 70s. This is your combat table, the contest table. That's going to convert pieces. So you'll notice the counter mix. Let's talk about that for a little while. The counter mix, I've got them sorted by province. So all of Alberta is in this space. All of British Columbia is in this space. All of Ontario is in this space. All 4 colors. The 4 different colors are groups running from separatists who believe that they should basically break Canada apart. Provincial autonomous, very, very loosely organized. Up to federalists, who will be a much more direct federal government having strong control. Not federalist in the sense of maintaining a federal system of separation, as much as federalist as in the Federalist Papers idea. The provincial moderates are more or less the status quo player. Although you're going to see that with these two kind of mixed. Okay. So you've got each of the different major provincial, well, each of the different provincial areas. You have the minor ones here too. You have like Newfoundland, tiny little thing, one constituency. Okay. So these are going to be divided into, most of the pieces will be constituents, and the number of constituents is fixed in each province. So Ontario has 14 constituents. And the only question is who controls them. And the combat table is going to allow you to shift constituencies towards yourself if you get a successful contest. If you get an unsuccessful one, it shifts your constituent that attacked towards the person you attacked. We also have civil servants here. Now, each province has its own premier, who's going to be elected when it's time for a provincial election based on who has the most constituents. The federal election is going to be based on the overall constituency, and you're basically going to be appointing the prime minister and his civil servants at that point. Whoever has the most constituents has the right to form a government. If he can find people who will ally with them that'll give him a majority, then he gets control of all the civil servants and can allocate them as he likes. Now, at the beginning of the game, the Federalists have all the civil servants except for the Commerce Secretary, who goes, or Minister, who goes over to the provincial moderates. There's no restriction on whom you can ally with. The Federalists could ally with the Separatists. That might seem a little weird, to tell you the truth, but there are probably some areas where there would be an agreement there. For example, they could make an agreement to federalize all laws except for the teaching of language in school and what languages are used in school or something like that, and allow that to be completely separatist in decision. And that you could have some kind of weird alliance like that, but that would be along the lines of, say, having, geez, I don't know, yeah, I can't think of a good example of that, where two basic factions are really so opposed diametrically, but they could actually agree on many of the subject matter involved. Of issues. So, for example, a very strong states' rights and federalists could come to agreement on a lot of particular solutions to issues and form a government which is willing to impose that without dealing with the main divide there, for just as an example. And then you have, similar to the constituencies, and again, there's only going to be one of each of these ministers in place, and there's only going to be one of each of these, which are special interests in place. Special interests are the most powerful pieces in a sense. They have a strength of 2 and a movement of 5. Well, there's one more powerful piece, which is the Prime Minister, strength of 3, movement of 3. The premiers have strength of 2, movement of 4. But there's limitations on those. Special interests can operate kind of more freely. The goal of the game is to collect a certain set of issues. And these are listed here for each color. These are going to be the important issues that you want to pick up. And this is actually kind of a similar victory condition to Dallas. which I really have to get up because nobody knows the game very well, and it's so cool. I'm probably the only person in the world who really thinks it's this cool, but I could never get anybody to play with me. But there's something very awesome about it. It doesn't play terribly well solitaire because it is a game mastered game. I really wish I could have gotten, but the problem is you need like 6 or 7 people for it to even work. All right, this 3 works. I think I've played it in 4 as well. You got your election table, which is going to run when there's a provincial election, which way things, how much things shift, how much things get shaken up during the provincial elections. Now, on the other side of this is the national emergency cycle. The national emergency theoretically shouldn't happen. If you're playing in the spirit of Canada and Canadian politics, you're not going to push it to this. Unfortunately, in most groups, if somebody's falling behind and doesn't think they can win, it feels right to make an all-out grab for power. And that's what the national emergency is. It's trying to spark an issue. For example, you could have Quebec declare that it's going to secede. And that would create a national emergency right off the bat. A national emergency is going to be the military game. And all the issues are going to go away, but we'll see. And the whole victory conditions changes there. And the national emergency, there's a possibility of a winner if everybody agrees to the person who's causing the emergency solution. But if anybody opposes it, and certainly somebody will, by the way, if everybody agrees, the person who suggested it wins the game and nobody loses. If it does go to a national emergency, there can only be losers. So essentially what you're saying is, okay, if you're playing the base game, you have to kind of try to interpret what winning, losing, and otherwise means. If you're playing the base game, the core of the game, somebody comes out winning the politics of Canada. Canada probably is not going to be wrecked as a society, right? As long as nobody calls a national emergency. So everybody's okay. However, one person has dominated the political scene. If you go to a national emergency, it is possible for everyone to lose. It's possible for some people to lose. It's impossible for anyone to win because the dislocations are so great, and this is reasonable because this is how war is. You don't win a war. You come out not much worse off than you perhaps were usually, but everybody loses a war. And in a sense, that's trying to capture this, but people who play it don't necessarily see it that way. What they're gonna see, as a friend of mine did, as some people in, say, Texas do, is this is too terrible. We must destroy everything we have because it is so very terrible what we have. Okay, so in this case, what are we looking at? If someone wanted to call a national emergency, that's a really hard to say. But you are looking at a military solution to what was a political issue. You're looking at either military secession or a fascist regime coming in from the Federalists or something along those lines. The one time that I played that it went to a national emergency that I can recall that succeeded, actually I'm not sure it did succeed. We were playing the, I'm not even sure you can do a national revolution in the national crisis in this one. We were playing Quiet Revolution. It was a 3-player game, and you don't have the separatists in that game. I was playing the moderates, the provincial moderates, I believe. And the guy who was playing the provincial autonomists saw that I was winning the game and decided to throw a national emergency. And boy, did we rag on him about that, simply because you're upset because the government is too moderate, you know. But if you look at, like I alluded to a little earlier, the situation in Texas where there's a strong secession feeling among some people and some other areas in the South. You kind of get a hint towards that, actually, where the recent administration is not ridiculously liberal. It may be far to the left of where Texas is, but it's actually not too different from the previous Republican administration in a lot of ways. It's a little shift back towards, say, 1970s Democrats. But, you know, to have this spirit of, oh, this is just too much. We've lived through this before. It wasn't that terrible, you know? You're not seeing the Gestapo on the street, but that is what the imagery that's presented is. So it's kind of a funny thing. Just, you know, I've always made fun of this game and that one play on those grounds, but now I see that kind of reaction going on. Anyway, how do you actually play this sucker? So the core game is as follows. At the beginning of the game, somebody gets determined to go first. This is completely random, and I'm not sure which side, whether I'm going to do it completely random. But then each player gets their own player turn, where they draw 2 of these cards, and there's a number of different cards here. These are all playable at will. Okay, so if you have an event, that means you control the release of that event, and you could just keep it in your pocket. Crisis, well, we'll explain the mechanism for that in a little bit. And we also have elections. And those are the 3 core types. There's also a national elections in here as well, somewhere. Okay. So you draw 2 of those cards, which you add to your hand, and you can play some of them. Trying to remember if there's a hand limit here. I don't seem to remember there being a hand limit, but there may be. Then you're allowed to move on the board, and essentially movement is pretty damn free. Within stacking restrictions, you can move up to your movement allowance through any spaces you like. That includes through opposing pieces. So something like, now that changes when we get to the military game, but something like this, I could just walk out here. It's very hard to use the terrain, as it were, to block somebody completely in. But the stacking restrictions, I believe, are 1 constituency? Nah, I don't think so. They're 1 issue and 2 other pieces is the maximum you're allowed to have in a space. I don't think, you don't usually want constituents to stack, but I don't think there's a limitation against that. Then you get to a contest phase where you're allowed to attack things that are adjacent to you. And adjacent being determined by these little bridges here. Now, what you do is you add up the strengths and you roll over here on the contest table. And what you'll get is a result of a C, which indicates that goes towards the person who's making the contest. So for example, if I got a C1, this green would change 1 color towards orange. Now orange is just 1 color away. But if it was red attacking, green would then turn to an orange piece. And then that's reflected with the little constituents markers to indicate and keep track of your numbers. And if a D happens, the conversion is from the attacker gets converted towards the defender's color. And then we go to an election phase. If you want to play any election cards, they're done at this point. If it's a provincial election, you essentially just roll on here. You cross-reference the number of issues that you control, and I'll explain issues in a little bit, to a die roll, and that's how far you're going to shift. However, you shift in a random direction, which means the guys on the end have kind of a cool bonus in the election cycles. They have a 50-50 chance, even if they don't win the election, that what's happening is that the electorate's moving further in beyond their position, which means they've got nowhere to run to. So if you're moving towards red as a Federalist, and you're already red, you just keep going further and further to, I guess, what would be considered the left. It's hard for me to tell because the left and right, as general terms used throughout history, fascism and communism, for example, fascism and socialism, are both totalitarian. Nobody wants that. But someone like Hitler or Franco is considered a rightist, whereas someone like Stalin is considered a leftist. Now, this is interesting because I see a different, more important balance, which kind of shows that, well, wait a minute. What is the freedom side of this? You know, if you're talking about fascism versus totalitarian socialism, well, that's not the axis that I want to talk about. I want to talk about a different axis. I want to talk about one which embodies the freedom of the individual against the state. The more anarchist side of things, which is sort of not on the balance at all, which I find very strange. Anyway, I've just always found that left-right thing to be weird. And you hear some of, again, going to modern topics, you hear some of the Tea Partiers realizing and coming forth with this and stating, no, wait a minute, you know, you're fascist. Those are absolute leftists. You know, there's more in common between what happens in a communist socialist type society and what happens in a fascist, classically called rightist society than there is in an anarchist society. And there's no place for them in that position. What is right and what is left there doesn't make a lot of sense. To me, actually, I think they've got this right, is that fascism is really just another more socialistic type experience. Okay, anyway, throwing some politics in because I know nobody's going to watch this sucker, even though it's a very cool game. Okay, anyway, once you make the rolls for the election, whoever has the most constituents in that province gets the premier. Just changes color to them. If there's a tie, they roll dice for it. There's also the national election, which is a little different. For the national election, you don't roll dice for issues. You just count constituents, and the person with the most constituents, like I said, has the right to form a government. He can cut deals to get that government formed, and those deals can involve appropriating the cabinet, which is the most obvious thing to do, but they can also involve, hey, I'll make you a trade, some promises in the future. There's nothing that can be automatically enhanced, handled at the moment, except perhaps the play of cards. Okay. In particular for an election. So, political opportunity cards. I seem to remember there was a 5-card limit here, but I'm not seeing that. So, the person whose turn it is has the right to allow other people to play cards, and that can be kind of an agreement thing. Normally, you wouldn't want to play cards in someone else's turn, but you can do it for them for a deal. I've explained the event cards in the sense that you take effect of what they're saying. For example, this has an effect for the current player turn. The elections, we know how they're handled. They're handled actually at a different point in the election phase. But these crises, for the crises to make sense, you have to understand the issues. For the issues to make sense, I have to explain them. Issues are not regular pieces. They can't move around on the board or do anything. But they do stack on the board. You're allowed one per space. They must be controlled, in general, to be on the board. To be controlled, they can either be sitting on a C space in which case the issue is controlled by the player who owns that color of the board, or they're stacked with a constituency. If they're stacked with a constituency, that constituent controls them. Otherwise, they are stacked with the C space. Now, to transfer an issue, this is kind of weird. You can do it through contesting. If you win the contest, I believe you get the issue if you have something that can take it. So if you have a constituent involved in the attack on an issue, you take the issue from wherever you're converting. So the constituency you're changing the color of may not go to your color completely. Let's say you're doing a red-blue combat. It may say end up at green or orange, but you still get the issue out of it if you have a constituent who can take it. Otherwise, it stays where it is under the control it's at. If, certain characters, certain pieces in the game can only contest if there's an issue in play. The premiers and the prime minister. I wanted to make sure it wasn't just the prime minister. So yeah, all the elected officials, the ministers don't really count, even though they're actually elected members. The premier and the premiers and the prime minister can only be involved in a contest if there is an issue at risk there. All right, I'm trying to remember. So a crisis will take an issue. So if there's a crisis in tax, everybody reveals the tax issues that they hold on the board. And then the person who played the card gets to pick one of those, and it moves into the crisis zone. If it's controlled by a constituency, the constituency remains on top of it and remains theoretically in control of it. When that player's turn comes, he can move it out of the crisis zone. It doesn't count as an issue under his control on here, though. And the crisis zone, like all areas, I think gives a modifier. It gives a modifier on the election table, as do the different sections: administrative, legislative, and grassroots. You're better off in your own territory for elections. You're better off not in opposing territory. If you're attacking, you get a penalty to attack if you've got pieces in the front in the enemy grassroots section. And you've got a penalty towards your election capabilities if you're in the crisis zone. You're more likely to swing one way or another. So that's how a crisis works. You could also play a crisis on a piece that's on a control space, in which case anything it's stacked with remains stacked under it. And it can't get out of the crisis zone. So if you're stacked with, say, the prime minister and a special interest, they can't control that issue, so they become absorbed in the issue and are stuck here until somebody contests it. Once somebody takes that issue off of them and perhaps changes their color, although you can attack your own pieces this way, then those pieces are free to move out of the crisis zone during the movement phase. You can never move into the crisis zone by just walking in. It's not a cheap way to attack across the board. And let's see. Okay. The national debate. The national debate allows you to veto a crisis, and you can also, once per turn, call for an issue to be put into the crisis zone, to create a crisis in an issue. This is done with a voting of constituents. If a majority votes with the person who tries to block a crisis or who tries to call a new item in, the item goes in. A lot of opportunity for deal making there. Usually people don't feel very comfortable in the games that I've played cutting those deals because, hey, I'll call something in your turn or for my turn and you support me, and then I'll gladly pay for it on Tuesday. Not easy to cut that deal because you don't know if they're going to win. If you look here, it only takes 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 issues, and I think there's 20 total in the game. No, there's more than 20. Looks like 25 total in the game. It's fairly easy to get the number of issues that you need. And once that starts to happen, it becomes very difficult to make any agreements that involve, yeah, I'll help you call one in. Unless you're approximately equal. You might cut it for a different reason, though. What else do we have? So we also have, if there are any rules disputes, those are handled with an election of constituent votes. You can't change the rules of the game, though, and the rules are fairly tight. There are maybe a few little ambiguities. They made them tighter than they imply that they do, at least in my opinion. But of course, if you're playing with more people, they have more opinions. So, the national emergency issue. Okay, so I vaguely explained this, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. But basically, only the person with the least issues has the right to call a national emergency. You can do it kind of at any time, I believe. It's not something I like doing. Yep. Unless someone declared they won. So, you compare the number of players for and against the national emergency, and you roll a die. If you get an N, the national emergency happens. If you do not, the person who called for it loses the game, and it's over. And that's all you know, is the person who called for it and anybody who supported it loses the game. Actually, no, just the person who called for it. After that, there's going to be a distinction between the rebellion and the federal government. I believe the person who controls the prime minister is the federal government. You're going to be rolling. So the rebellion, the federal government gets most of the federal troops. They may not get the Francophone troops if under certain circumstances. The provincial troops, you roll whether or not they join the rebellion. Then the federal player has the option to call up provincial troops to support him, and he rolls. And they may go either way under those circumstances. And that's involving this loyalty table. And then it is the federal government's job to wipe out every piece that the rebellion has. All these pieces flip over to a weaker side, where you can see, for example, constituencies move slower. And essentially, you're trying to impose martial law as the federal player on the rebellion. You're trying to break the rebellion. Put down all the constituencies that are kind of violent, destroy all the military pieces, definitely. Put down, special interests, which they become almost powerless in this. Easily arrested. And the combat table for this uses this arrest table for personalities, I believe. I don't know, you've got 3 different tables here for combat. I never basically play this. So if there's military units, if the defender has military, only military units can attack. These other units all end up with parenthesized combat strength, which means they cannot attack anymore. So if the defender has military units, it goes on the combat results table. I believe if the defender has constituencies, it goes on the riot table. And then if you go to the other things, civil service interest groups, premiers, and prime minister, you go on the arrest table. So, the attack starts off on the combat results table. Any losses there are only applicable to military units. Any losses here are only applicable to constituencies. You don't get to the riot table if you don't win the combat, if you don't clear the enemy off the using the combat results table. Then if you clear the riot, you're allowed to make an arrest. And essentially, any pieces that are attacked successfully come out of the game. They will not reappear. Your objective is to wipe everyone out. You've got 6 turns to do it. 6 sequences of Federalist versus Rebel. All the players have to choose a side, either for the national emergency or against, and their pieces end up under the control of the person who either called the national emergency or, well, as kind of a coalition for the other side, I guess. It doesn't really matter. You're all stuck in a boat at that point. And the only thing that can happen is you can lose the game if you lose the national emergency cycle. So you can lose the game by getting eliminated for the rebellion. Oh, I'm sorry, it's only the constituencies that have to be eliminated. It's not all the units on the board. The government can lose the game. I'm not sure what. So someone like a premier just adds 1 to the defensive strength in a riot or combat results table. He doesn't really do much in the game at all. It's the constituencies that have to be protected. So you can lose the game through all your constituents being wiped out as the rebellion, failing to do it in 6 turns as the government, or sort of the worst case of all, by failing to get the national emergency to succeed. If all 4 players agree to the national emergency, the game's over and the person who called for it wins. They've, installed their form of government peacefully without any disagreement. Now remember, this is the person with the least control of the issues. Yes, I know, it was muddled as all hell. Such is life, Unfortunately, I know the rules better in my head, having played it a lot, than I can explain them. All right, let's send this one up.